So springtime is upon us, and it's time to get your garden ready for the season. Today we want to go over some of the key things that need to be looked at in order to be ready to plant for spring. The first thing that we want is our current garden and make sure that we have cleared out any old weeds, any dead plant material. We want to think about pruning back any perennials that are left in the garden, shaping up things that are a little bit overgrown so that we can have an idea of what space we have left when we plan out our new spring garden. So here's an example of our garden after the winter, after the snow and cold. So one of the things we're going to do to prep is to basically cut back anything that we don't want, prune back any perennials, like this passion vine here. It all died in the snow, but the roots are still alive. It's already got some new shoots coming on, so we're going to go ahead and prune this back and prune back anything else in the garden so that we can be prepared to plant in the upcoming weeks. It's important to make sure that we get rid of weeds in the garden because weeds will in turn create competition. They're going to take up nutrients, water, all the different resources that your plants also need, and that can lead to that competition and potentially over time lower your yield. So we always want to make sure that we start off with a clean slate and clean beds. So when it comes to removing plants from the previous season or something that you no longer want in your garden, we take a simple approach to this. So microbes and mycorrhizal fungi have cultivated and attached to the root systems of most of these plants, and instead of pulling them up and disrupting that, what we'll do is we'll simply cut it off at the base, a little bit below the soil. Most of these plants aren't going to grow back, and if we see that they're sprouting again, we'll just give them another snip, and usually they'll die out. When we do that, leaving the organic matter underneath the soil there, which in turn the microbes will break down, and it'll long term, you're closing the circle, feeding the soil with the old organic matter. Now, if you were to have a plant that you're pulling up that had potentially a disease or a large pest problem, sometimes you might want to pull it up and dispose of it so that you can mitigate the potential risk of getting that same disease later on or the next season. So after we've gotten our cleanup done, we need to focus on prepping the soil for the new season. So if you've had a garden for a while and you've been using your beds over and over again, one of the things that we always want to encourage people to do is to test your soil. It's vital to know what your pH is and also potentially what macronutrients are in the soil and what levels they're at. What we don't want to do is over apply nutrients because they can bind up other nutrients in the soil. We also want, while we're planning ahead, to know where the pH is, because if the pH is not in the optimal zone for whatever we're planting, then our plants aren't going to be able to get the nutrition that they need. And pH change naturally takes a long period of time. If we need to make the soil more acidic with sulfur or more alkaline with lime, applying that into the soil in a natural way takes a long period of time for that to break down and then to make that change, sometimes 4 to 6 months. There are several different ways that you can test your soil. One, you can contact your local agricultural extension office, and they offer soil tests that you can send off, and you can get a lot more detailed results with pretty exact numbers. Sometimes those soil tests can be a little difficult to read to figure out what you want to do. We encourage you to take those results to your local garden center or ourselves, and we can help you figure out exactly what you need to amend your soil to correct any problems that you might have. You can also consider simply just purchasing a soil test kit like this one from Luster Leaf. These will give you a pretty good idea of where your soil stands for macronutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, and your pH. They might not be dead on accurate, but really all we're wanting to do is get a pretty close idea. And if everything is good, we don't need to make any changes. So once we figured out if we need to make any amendments to adjust the nutrients in our soil, we also want to consider, do we need to add anything to our beds? As organic matter breaks down, and depending on the types and the density of the organic matter in your bed, larger particles that are going to break down into smaller and smaller particles until they're really fine. Whereas if you have a soil that already has fine particles, you're going to see less shrinkage happen inside your bed. So what we want to do is we want to consider what we want to add into our beds. So if we're missing a couple inches of soil in our bed, we need to add something to it. And oftentimes what we'll recommend is compost. Compost contains tons of slow release nutrition and typically has lots of beneficial microbes in it. So what we like to do is we like to add that to the top layer. We'll put a couple inches of a high quality compost, like leaf mold compost, cottonberry compost. There's all kinds out there. You can use a mixture of them. Really, it comes down to your preference. We add that to the top layer because compost is slow release, as we mentioned. And by adding it to the top, this layer of compost is going to work its way through the soil as moisture comes through and as we water. So this gives us the full benefit from top to bottom across the bed, and making sure that when we plant new young seedlings in here that are going to have small root systems, that we're getting the value of that compost and we're getting the benefit of it by placing it in the top layer. If we've lost a lot of volume in the bed, 4-6 inches, then we could consider going in with some type of a mix, a raised bed soil, something that's going to be well draining and fill that volume up a little more economically. We also want to consider what we're going to fertilize with. So we need to make sure we're providing the soil with tons of nutrition. We always want to remember we fertilize soil, not plants. The soil is going to break down the nutrients in that fertilizer, and then it's going to become available to the plants. We always like to keep things natural, so we like to use a slow release, quality organic fertilizer. In our area, Microlife 624 tends to be one of our favorites. It's inoculated with microbes. It has molasses and humates in there just to keep a nice ecosystem in our soil and keep a living soil. There's also lots of other options out there. True Organics, a little more economical, but it doesn't really matter. Pick what works best for you. When we work with slow release nutrition, we want to ensure that we are putting that fertilizer in the top layer. We could actually layer it in before we do our compost to kind of hold it in place, but most of the time we'll spread that fertilizer into the top layer of soil evenly across the whole bed, and then we'll kind of work it into the top 2 to 3 inches of soil, because as that fertilizer breaks down in a slow release, it's going to again work its way through the soil. We want to make sure that we've got plenty of nutrients in that top layer so that our plants get the most benefit out of it. We also want to consider looking at the density of our existing soil. So we can add organic matter and lots of good things to the top layer, but is our lower base layer, is it compacted? Do we need to add something to it to ensure that we're getting the proper drainage we need to get the best results? We oftentimes will like to just grab the soil, get a good nice handful, and give it a squeeze, press it into a ball, and then let it go and kind of see how it crumbles apart. Check the soil texture, making sure that it's nice and crumbly and loose, which it is. So this bed is still in really good shape. Kind of break up the top layer here a little bit, because it's kind of just compacted just a little bit. And you can see our old mulch layer of pine straw that started to break down. There's not much of it left. We'll top that off after we add some compost soil, fertilizer, or any other amendment that we need. If the soil holds together too well, then we potentially could have a drainage problem. So this could kind of lead us to know we might need to make an amendment. One way you can amend a dense soil or a clay-like soil is to use expanded shell. Expanded shell will last a really long time, a lot longer than perlite, and it basically disrupts particles from bonding together. It also has little microscopic pores in it, and it'll hold moisture and oxygen, helping you to aerate the soil, and which will benefit not only the root systems but also the microbes that are in the soil. So once we've kind of got our soil and our beds prepped, we've got them cleaned up, we've got them amended, we should really consider what it is that we want to plant. Do you have a plan for your garden for the spring? Do you know what you actually utilize in the kitchen, or that you're going to use a lot of, or things that you use less of, so that you can strategically plan to plant the right amount of particular varieties to get what you need? And oftentimes this is an experiment. Sometimes we're going to plant too much of one thing and not enough of the other. But that also leads me to one thing that most gardeners don't really do, and that's keeping some form of notes or a gardening journal so that you can really document your successes and failures. This can really help you dial in your ability to increase your yield and really get a quality, successful harvest. We need to consider whether or not our goal is just to grow vegetables, or do we want herbs, or have we even thought about putting flowers in the mix? Really and truthfully, we need a good combination of all these. A diverse landscape and garden is really important because this is a way we can naturally control some of the pest we'll experience. It can also help us mitigate lots of other problems. We can plant accordingly to have one plant provide shade for another. We can also make sure we're including flowers of different shapes, textures, colors, and sizes so that we're attracting a diverse amount of pollinators. We oftentimes find people come in and they don't have any bees, or that we're not seeing enough pollinators. And what really the underlying cause is there's no diversity in the garden. They may have flowers and such in the landscape, but they're far away. We need to bring these elements together in close proximity so that we can get the most benefit from it. Another thing that we want to consider is, do we commonly plant all of our species of plants in one bed and in one group? So if we have multiple beds, it's a great practice to split up some of your plantings. The reason being is because if we have a particular species of plant and it's prone to a certain pest or disease, we could have those same species opposite in a different bed or on the other side of the garden. And that may lead to us discovering a problem on one side of the garden and being able to mitigate or solve that problem without having to do anything to the other. Or in turn, if the problem is something that we're going to need to remove the plant or we're going to lose our harvest altogether, we can then make necessary adjustments to those other plants and try to save them and prevent the problem from happening over there. It's also important, if we have multiple beds, that we plan and have some form of a layout or notations, because we want to be able to rotate our crops. In the climate that we have in Zone 9A, it gets very hot and humid, and this can lead to certain pests that are very difficult to control, and it can also lead to different diseases that plants will get that are oftentimes not curable. There's nothing we can really buy or spray to take care of that. And a lot of these pests and disease can harbor in the soil from season to season, and you can get the same problem over and over again. So by utilizing crop rotation, we can also ensure that we're not planting the same things year after year in the same place. Ideally, we would like to be able to have a minimum of a 3-year rotation. So we plant in year one layout, we plant the same layout in this bed in year 2, and finally in this layout, the same layout again in year 3. And then after year 3, we'll cycle back to the first bed. Now this is something that might not always be feasible for people with very small gardens. And we understand that. But we just encourage you to do your best to try to rotate and not plant things in the same area over and over again. Another thing to consider about planting is, do you really have any kind of water source, any form of shelter for beneficial insects and beneficial wildlife? Things as simple as a frog, a bird, they can take care of naturally a lot of pests in the garden, but they can also kind of become our enemy because they will also damage our produce if they don't have the actual necessary needs in their vicinity to take care of daily life. So we always like to encourage people to have fresh water sources, clean water sources available in the landscape around the yard to draw things like birds and other pests away. You can also use a water source with a landing pad in order for pollinators like honeybees to stop and get a drink. They oftentimes need moisture and they're going to go to the closest source. So providing that in the local environment is a great way to keep pollinators in your garden area. Lastly, in the planting phase, we want to think about, based upon previous seasons or just observing our environment, do we need to create any kind of system to help protect our plants, such from frost, freeze, or do we need to provide some form of a shade structure to mitigate the afternoon really hot summer heat that kind of just scorches plants? The goal is to relieve stress from your plants so that they can take the energy they're getting from the soil and the sun and utilize it to increase their yield and for you to get a better harvest. Next, we want to consider, do we need to start seeds or are we really just going to be using transplants? It's really important to know how long a seed is going to take to become a viable transplant large enough for you to put out in the garden. So you want to make sure you plant accordingly. If you're wanting to seed things like peppers and tomatoes, in Zone 9A we want to be targeting putting those seeds in sometime late December. If you wait too late to plant things like tomatoes and peppers, for example, by seed, you're going to end up planting those transplants later in the season, and by the time they're ready to actually produce, it's going to be much hotter in our area, and that can lead to either decreased or no yield depending on if it's too hot, but it also is going to bring on a greater chance of disease and pest pressure. As we get hotter, it gets more humid, so diseases like blight will be more prevalent on peppers and tomatoes, and things like aphids, sap-sucking insects, they're going to be more prone to be on a plant whenever they're under a lot of stress. And that hot summertime or those late spring temperatures that we get, they just get really hot and plants don't love it. So overall, make sure that you're checking how long it takes to germinate the specific seeds that you're looking to plant. Make sure that you pay attention to what seeds need to be direct sowed. A lot of things like root crops are only going to be put direct sowed into your beds and should not be done in seed trays prior to putting into the garden. But we just want to plan ahead, making sure we give ourselves ample time to create a quality transplant that's going to give us a good yield. Another thing that we should really consider doing in our home garden is really looking around at the structures and the tools that we have. Do we actually have everything we need to comfortably complete the job and make it an enjoyable task? Are our beds in good condition? Should we be checking the beds for rot if they're made out of some form of wood or material that can deteriorate over time? Are our beds workable and easy to access? Do we need to tighten any bolts or make any repairs to modular or metal beds? We like to look at this before we get really into the season, because once we're growing and there's plants everywhere, a lot of times these kinds of things get looked over time and time again. Although we really don't use a lot of tools in our raised bed gardens personally, we do like to encourage you to make sure that we have tools that are in good condition, that are sharp. We keep something simple like this Hori Hori knife from Vigo Garden. We like this a lot because we can do a lot of things with it. That's really the main thing we use in lieu of a regular hand trowel or a cultivator. But really, it's whatever you prefer. But we want to make sure that we keep our tools clean, that we keep a good edge on it if it's something that needs to be sharpened. This guy here really needs to be cleaned up. I've been using it a lot lately, and I haven't taken the time to clean it. And eventually that'll lead to it rusting, potentially damaging the edge. So just pay attention to your tools and take care of them. One of the other things that is commonly not done is taking care of your pruning shears. Regardless of how good your shears are, making sure that they stay clean and that they also stay sharp. A sharp blade is going to make a nicer cut on a plant, and it's going to reduce a plant's recovery time. When you cut on something, it's got to heal itself. So if we make a jagged cut, and it may look fine to us, the recovery time for a plant may be longer and it may use more resources. So we always like to encourage you to keep sharp, clean tools. So now that we've kind of got everything ready, we've got a plan, we've amended the soil, we really need to consider what we're going to do to protect these plants as they begin to grow. One of the biggest things that you can do is ensure that you're using mulch in the garden. We like to use pine straw. This particularly works really well for us for large wide leaf vegetables such as cucumbers, squash. We can keep those leaves off the soil, keeping the water off of it and reducing the leaf diseases that will tend to spread upward on the vine as water splashes. You can either use pine straw or you can use a good quality composted native hardwood mulch. You want to make sure it's composted. We don't want big chunks, thick chunks of organic matter, because over time that organic matter, as it tries to break down, it's going to use up nitrogen in the soil, and we can actually deplete nitrogen, which is one of the main things we need to get things to grow. In our planting stage, we really thought about what we could do to protect our garden from some things such as frost or freeze, snow, or just the sun itself. Now's the time to implement those and make sure that we have that system in place before our plants really get going. This is going to allow them to be much healthier, much happier. And for instance, if we are implementing a shade structure or some form of protection, then we're going to decrease the amount of water we're going to need, because the water is going to stay more prevalent in the soil. It's not going to dry out as fast. So there's lots of benefits to having a plan and a system in place before we really get planting and in full swing of the spring garden season. Planting early and putting a system of protection in to prevent frost or freeze damage can really lead you to an early harvest and eliminate some of the chances for pest and disease that can come when we get into those hot and humid times. And keep in mind though that planting early is not always going to be a success. Sometimes the weather's just going to get it anyway, and at the end of the day we're still going to be in the same position that most people who plant a little bit later, early spring, we're going to be in that same position they are, and we're still going to have a chance for a good harvest. But ideally we try to plant some things a little bit early and protect them in hopes of being able to get an early harvest. So we've covered quite a few things, so let's kind of recap over that. First, we want to clean up our garden space area and get rid of plants and things that need to be out of the way for the upcoming season. Then we want to prepare our soil by amending, fertilizing, aerating, doing anything else that we need to get our soil right. Next, we want to plan our garden and make sure we have a solid foundation, an idea of what we want to do so that we can get the best results possible. Next, we want to start seeds if necessary to make sure they're ready in time for proper planting. We want to maintain, repair, and install any kind of structure or tool and have everything at tip-top shape so that we can not have to worry about that kind of stuff and be ready to just take care of the plants and enjoy our garden space. Next, we need to protect our plants and make sure we have those systems thought out and ready to go so we can prevent common problems that we know are going to come up during the growing season. And finally, consider early planting where appropriate so that we can try to beat the heat, beat some of the pests and disease, and have a great productive season. If you found this information useful, please consider subscribing or hitting the like button. We would love to see you check out more content and stay tuned for lots of upcoming information. Thanks for watching.